Heavenly Father,
Father,
Divine Mother,
Father,
Friend, Beloved
Divine
God,
Mother,
Great Masters of Self-Realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, Beloved Guru, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all traditions, humbly we invoke thy blessings. Divine Mother, beloved Gurus, we come together before you this evening as a spiritual family. We humbly ask that you open our hearts to your holy vibration and open our minds to your intuitive guidance. Help us to integrate your teachings through this satsang this evening. Give yourself to us so we may share you with all. Om, peace. Amen. All right, well, thank you everyone and welcome. This is a wonderful event we're having. Melvin is a dear devotee, a dear friend to all of us, and he's been a devotee of Master since 1981. So many, many years. Great wisdom. Melvin grew up in the civil rights movement, and that's what he'll be talking to, some of what he'll be talking to us about this evening. But he's also quite a learned professor, and he's taught all over the country on race relations and cultural integration. So with that, Melvin, we'll hand it over to you, and we are thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
Melvin, you just have to unmute yourself, okay?
thank you so much, Kyle. I want to thank Kyle for coming up with the idea to have this workshop or have this presentation this evening. I want to thank Pasqualina, who listened to my musings for numerous hours. And I want to thank Giovanna, because Giovanna is someone who has experience in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. She may not confess it, but she took her life in her hands to serve in the civil rights movement during the 1960s in one of this country's most dangerous towns, a little place called Bogalusa, Louisiana. I also want to posthumously thank my magnificent mom for what she did as I passed through some dangerous and unpleasant occurrences in order to reach the point where I could be open to Yogananda. It was in 1983 that I finally listened with an open heart to a colleague who is a close friend and someone who was a devotee from her childhood. And this was Master's way of reaching me. I had seen the autobiography of a yogi on numerous occasions. I had mistaken Master's identity. I thought he was a woman, and because of the long hair. And I in that period of time, I was also very closed to the fact that I was a sexist. And so Master went, after giving me numerous opportunities, because I must have seen the autobiography in bookstores for numerous years. And I am someone who is very curious. So why I didn't pick the autobiography up earlier is still a mystery to me. But this friend had a spiritual presence that I could actually perceive. Um, and so she was the agent that brought me to Yogananda. I want um, uh, to talk about the race portion of the talk tonight initially. And I want to share with you a incident which happened, which may illustrate the impact of race in my hometown in during my earlier years. My magnificent mother had taken me to a local clothing store in my hometown, which was Greenville, Mississippi. Greenville was perhaps the third largest town in the community, in the state of Mississippi during the late 1940s and 1950s as I was growing up. And it was perhaps deserving of the reputation that, as far as Mississippi towns went, it was sort of a liberal haven, uh, not in terms of how the nation would have perceived the term liberal haven, but just insofar as Mississippi was concerned. And so we went to a local clothing store in Greenville in the white section of the town. And basically, Greenville at that point was comprised of white sections and black sections. And there was not a lot of interaction between the two. For one thing, I lived in Greenville until I went to college, from about the age of 2. During that time, I never came close to having a white friend because both of us, a white person who would have wanted to get to know me and a black person, which I was, wanting to know someone white, there were penalties to prevent that happening. And the most powerful of them was the tradition. And traditions were strong in Mississippi at this time. There was something called the etiquette of race, which governed interactions. And though I did not realize all of this at the time, my mother understood very clearly the etiquette of race. So this day, we go into the clothing shop, and my mother helps me pick out a suit to try on. Now, in other communities at the time, it might not have been possible for me to try on a suit in a store like that. But in Greenville, that was possible. So I put on this suit and I come out, and in order uh, to kind of show my mother the fit of the suit and how much I liked it. And I buttoned the suit coat the way that I wanted the suit coat to be buttoned. The young white salesman who was assisting us immediately, without talking to me, decided to rebutton the suit according to his preference. Now, to me, this violated what my dad had demonstrated. My dad was one of the three first job printers in Greenville. And so there were two other Black printers who owned their own shop and equipment in Greenville. And if you were a church or if you were someone who was putting on entertainment, then you likely would select one of these printers, these three printers, to do business with. And so the model which I was using was what I saw in my dad's print shop, that the customer is the one who is always right. Well, I decided to rebutton, uh, my coat after he had rebuttoned it. And I can still hear my mother's words to me, Melvin, don't do that. And that was quite unusual for my mother to have that tone in public. She might say, something like that in private to me, but rarely would she be other than a model of temperate, a model of moderation when she was talking to me in public. So I wondered immediately what I had done. Even in those early years, my mother was sort of the main uh, guidance for me. And so I did not want to displease her, but at the same time, I felt I should hang on to what I knew at the time. So when the young salesman attempted to rebutton my suit, I turned away from him to present the option with my mother's words still in my ears. Ultimately, we purchased the suit, and then later on, I don't recall it as being immediately after we left, but when my mother calmed down, she explained she explained to me the history of her thinking. And about 2 years earlier in Greenville, there had been a young boy who was about 15 who had come to visit Mississippi from Chicago. And the young boy had gone into a white-owned store and had apparently become familiar with a married white woman who was the co-owner of the store. And after this incident had occurred, he had been taken from his grandfather, who he was visiting, and he was dismembered, and his body was placed in a local river and weighted down in a fashion. And so my mother was aware of that history. I was vaguely aware of it, but I did not have a good sense of how big Mississippi was. And I dismissed the importance of the story, thinking that nothing like that could happen to me. And however, as I grew older, I became aware that yes, this could have happened to me. And my mother was protecting me. So that story, I hope, illuminates some of the challenges that Mississippi has faced ever since it engaged slavery and then what happened after slavery. So if we think of uh, the way that my parents raised me, relatively speaking, I would say I was a middle class, or more accurately, perhaps a middle caste uh, citizen of um, Greenville, Mississippi. And initially, the system had been so effective in its conditioning that it created someone like me. Why do I say middle caste? And it's because I have learned from a new recent book published earlier this year on the subject of caste. And I think it uh, matches to some degree uh, what my experience was in Mississippi. I was different in the sense that both of my parents had a degree of independence. As I mentioned, my dad was a job printer who then did not have to work um, uh, closely with the white community. His principal business our principal customers, were members of the local uh, African American community. My mother was a second grade teacher in one of Mississippi's all Black uh, community communities at that point. So just having two parents who were independent in a community which had an a etiquette of race, which all communities in the Deep South, I believe, did have at the time we're talking about. This is pre uh, the civil rights movement. Uh, I was fortunate. I was also fortunate that my mother could first formulate a plan for me to leave Mississippi uh, because she thought so much about my danger, and uh, and then she could execute that plan. So even when I was uncertain where I wanted to go for college, in other words, I had said, to myself, it would be desirable for me uh, to pick up some of the challenges that have been uh, cited by the leaders of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and then to go to college uh, somewhere. I had no idea, however, of where I would go to college, because in Mississippi, I would not have been able to go to a desegregated school. And somehow it was important to me to go somewhere that was desegregated. I couldn't have gone in Texas or Alabama or uh, Arkansas or let's say I mentioned Alabama or Texas at that point. Um, all of these communities of the Deep South were foreclosed to me. Tennessee, I left out, um, and so my mother called up my favorite uncle, who was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, uh, an attorney on something in Tulsa called the Black Wall Street. And he said to her, "You should have Melvin go to Oklahoma State University." We interviewed at one school, my family and I, and that was it. And I didn't apply anywhere else. And fortunately, I was taken. I was, as far as the history uh, suggests, I was the first African American student to attend Oklahoma State University from Mississippi. There were about 70 of us at the time I attended. So it was not a significant contribution as far as the history of the university. But for my family, it was important. Um, I had people who went and finished college on both sides of my lineage. Um, the favorite uncle that I referred to, somehow, after going to the first African American college, or the oldest African American college in Mississippi, a school called Alcorn, or some people would say Alcorn uh, College in Mississippi. Uh, but he also attended for his law degree, which he received in 1935. He somehow attended the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. How he did it, I wish now I could have known what I know now and asked and been able to ask him that question. How did you get to the University of uh, Nebraska at Lincoln as somebody who was a member of a caste? This notion of caste is perhaps just as important as the notion of race. And so whenever we think of the term caste, we think of it as applying to um, India rather than to the United States. So much of important history in terms of race and caste then has to do um, with India. So the um, the notion of caste then, as it's explained in the recent book that I saw, um, and we can um, disseminate this as a part of uh, some resources that we can uh, uh, send by um, email to people. Um, it's done by uh, Wilkerson, and I have a copy of it somewhere. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. And it's worth reading if you want to really understand the um, the circumstances of groups in American society. Um, and it's influenced so much by, once again, the way that India approached caste. So as we know, we started out here in the United States with several nations bringing Africans to the United States. And among the uh, nations which left their impact on the United States were, of course, the English, who perhaps, insofar as the continental United States is concerned, had the most important impact. But there was also the Spanish who had an impact. And so much of the times we leave that history out, the history of Spain. There is France, where France, of course, leaves a major impact on Louisiana. And then there is Africa. And let's take for a moment a question of when Africans arrived in the Americas. One of the major issues that my first wife and I were concerned when we entered the newly emergent field of Black studies was this question of how to appraise the contributions of Christopher Columbus. And of course, if you were following the English canon, then you were likely to place a lot of emphasis on Africans arriving as captives or slaves in 1619, brought on a Dutch ship to the United States. And when when I learned about slavery in college, there wasn't much to learn in the high school that I went to. But when I learned about slavery the uh, in this early period, then the emphasis was on the passive nature of those African captives who were brought to the United States. So most of the times, this put the students in the class that I was in, it put them to sleep uh, when their perspective was that uh, this was not particularly that interesting. But then, if you take the Spanish, for example, the Africans who they brought here came in different capacities and with different skills. So they were scouts, they were translators, and at least one person who came to the United States in the wake of Columbus coming to the United States with his 3 voyages. The they come, and one African rebels against the Spanish and escapes to the Native Americans in 1526. That's a different picture than the passive Africans who come to the United States under the English canon in 1619. And hopefully I'll be able to work with Kyle and Pascalina to get these uh, out to you. Most of what I'll send is easily available, but if anybody is teaching children, I still recommend, despite the English orientation of these sources, I recommend them because they are of uh, great interest, at least to me. And so the Africans, let's come to the African canon. So in the African canon, the emerging scholarship, which is always, well, I shouldn't say always been there, but has been there since at least 1920. In 1920, a Harvard professor by the name of Leo Weiner, who was white, published a book called Africa and the Origins of America. And what he believed is that Africans had preceded Columbus in coming to the, the Americas. Now, he wasn't the only one. There have been several sources who have, uh, argued back and forth about whether or not this is a mirage or whether or not it is, quote, reality. But the important issue for Black studies, for people interested in Black studies, was just simply raising this as an area for people to investigate in a scholarly fashion. And that's the way I see it now after 40 years of really discussing it with people who believe this hypothesis and people who are strongly opposed to to the hypothesis. So then moving away from the question of what, when did Africans first come to the Americas, there is a subsequent question, which is how does slavery originate in the United States? And how is it then a precedent to this notion of caste that we will talk about? So initially then, slavery seems to have started then in the tobacco growing areas. And this is partially because of the nature of the work which is being done. The states or then the colonies of North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland were where Africans first seem to have been forced to practice their agricultural knowledge. What is underplayed, and this is a matter we'll talk about on the caste too, is that the Africans have skills, and that is why they become attractive in the agriculture of tobacco initially. So the farmers, the planters, the plantation owners initially are practicing with the labor of Native Americans and of white indentured servants. But by the 17th century, Africans have been brought in. And because of their skills, because of their resistance to disease, then they are the ones who sort of win out in this weird competition of raising crops. Tobacco seems to be first, rice seems to be second, and cotton seems to be third. And this, of course, is Mississippi's great crop too, the raising of cotton. And so we tend to think of all of this as just applying to the South, particularly the Deep South. But as we've learned in the last decade or so, even right here in Rhode Island benefits significantly from perhaps the most important business during the early years of the country. And it benefits from slavery too. Some of you probably have seen the documentary Traces of the Trade. It's done by a young woman, Katrina Brown, who was a member of her family, grew up without learning from her family that most of the family wealth had been gotten from the slave trade. So though Rhode Island did not have the plantations or the land area that would have allowed people to actually do the raising. The question of support is a complicated one. And so the DeWolf family of Rhode Island became one of the wealthiest families in the country by providing the support services for slavery. And Rhode Island, this despite the fact that Rhode Island had been the first state in New England to abolish slavery. But somehow in Rhode Island, from what I hear, the law was passed in 1843 abolishing slavery, but it was not effectively enforced. And this was, of course, one of the reasons. And it really didn't need to be, because there were all these support services. There is uh, a person who I mentioned because during the time I was at the University of Rhode Island, there were people who were descendants of a plantation owner here in Rhode Island by the name of Robert Hazard. And at URI, there were several students who came to the university who had the last name as of Hazard. And we constantly tried to find out whether they were in fact descendants. It's more than likely they were, but how they were descendants of Robert Hazard. So slavery. Slavery then becomes the way Africans engage and are engaged in America. And then, as we know, the Civil War comes into play, and the consequence of a consequence of the Civil War is the passage of the 13th Amendment, which is said to be one of the factors which closed down slavery in the nation. The uh, the Civil War is certainly impacted when President Lincoln issues in 1863 the Emancipation Proclamation. And that Emancipation Proclamation, we remember, was Lincoln's way of kind of winning the war. So my belief is still that when Black soldiers enter the war in 1864, that they began to change the course of the war from the Southern side, from the side of the Confederates, and the Yankees, then the side of the North, the side of the Union, began to be critically important at that point. And ultimately, Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation is a major reason that the United States, or that the Union, was able to win the Civil War. In any event, there are many people then who believe that the Reconstruction after the Civil War presents them an opportunity to become full-fledged citizens of the country. I should point out, too, in an effort to try to illuminate some of the problems that we have in the country at this point, that this is also the period in the South where police forces began, or police functions began to develop. So the Southern states began to utilize, uh, kind of small militias to begin the control of uh, uh, escaped slaves or other dissidents in the area. But slavery is the real reason, that police forces began. And it is this origin of the police forces in the South during slavery that somehow impacts and lasts uh, all the way up to the present. And so when we see now some of the attitudes that have resulted in the killing of so many uh, Black adolescents, and uh, though the young men have gotten greater attention, this is also a danger for young African American women too. And so it's back again to the kind of fear and anger that perhaps we have on both sides in the country that somehow has to be addressed. So if I were putting up a little place to have markers at this point, then I would say that um, the it is important to realize, if we're going to correct the problems that exist between African American communities and police, that we also should have everyone be aware that the origins of police are at least in the South, are in an effort to patrol and police escaped slaves and to bring order to society in that way. And it may explain to a degree why there is a devaluing of Black life and why the young people in this generation have come up with the term Black Lives Matter. Also, with regard to slavery, I think it's fair to say that initially the uh, that slavery presented problems in a number of ways. It was perhaps the major factor in the economy of the southern states, that they were more dependent on the South, on slavery, than were the northern states. So the northern states benefited from slavery, but it was the southern states who were almost dependent upon slavery as an economic institution. And so this, at some point, we have to be aware that this will probably mean that and this may be an instance for our children and our grandchildren to resolve. But at some point, the question of providing compensation for compensated labor during slavery is going to be an issue that will come to the policy table of the United States. The slavery then begins to become, after the Civil War, what Isabel Wilkerson calls caste. The Supreme Court of the United States is an important factor in dealing with the conversion of race thinking in the United States to the what she says is the caste reality. And so she defines caste as dependent upon two factors. That first, you are born into caste. And then secondly, that you must marry within caste. The Mississippi that I grew up in fit both of those patterns very well. That as an African American child in Mississippi, I would be born into a group which was separate from other groups. Then secondly, marriage in the Mississippi that I grew up in, it would have been against the law for there to be marriage between us, between, say, me and a white girl in that society. So the court cases that I would point to in concluding this portion of the talk are at least three that I can think of. One of the most important ones is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This court case then is the one that comes up with the doctrine of separate but equal. And so by a 7-1 decision of the Supreme Court, the doctrine of separate but equal, which created the racial segregation that Wilkerson believes brought about the caste system. That's the case that creates separate but equal. In 1954, I was very fortunate to have at least a legal decision by the Supreme Court in the case of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall, the attorney, the lead attorney for the NAACP in that case, is still one of my favorite figures in history, because as I learned after I was in college, it was that case which allowed me to actually attend Oklahoma State University. And if that case comes after, I am college age, then I am not sitting here talking to my spiritual family today. And the third case is the one which ends, upholds interracial marriage. That case is called Loving versus the state of Virginia. And Virginia is making an effort then to say that at the state level, that the decision should be made at the state level, then the Supreme Court decides that it is unconstitutional uh, in uh, in order for uh, interracial marriage to be prohibited. So then the question then of how this relates to um, our spiritual path and to Yogananda. I would like to point out that there is an author by the name of Philip Goldberg who has a section, a couple of paragraphs in his book about Yogananda, about the challenges that Yogananda faced as he toured the country in the 1920s in order to establish his philosophy and to present it to Americans. Quote, while Yogananda was conducting his New York classes in 1924, Congress was formulating one of the most restrictive immigration laws in US history, the Johnson-Reed Act, whose stated purpose was to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. Now, this doesn't say race specifically, but you know, how direct can you be without actually stating, um, you know, the term race? To continue just for another sentence, Yogananda would confront racial bigotry of the virulent kind a few years later in Miami. There are newspaper clippings about Yogananda and his reception by the city of Miami in the 1920s, and he is actually asked to leave without being able to present his one of his talks there. And so this is a background statement that suggests that Master had to deal with the factor of having a dark skin in a society that was oriented toward whiteness. Now, the question of the path that we have taken and its approach to race, I think, is one which does imply that racism is in fact a disease. And that's the point that Brother Chidananda of Self-Realization Fellowship made for the first time earlier this year, a very direct statement responding to the protests that were taking place all over the United States around the factor of race. And in some ways motivated by the Black Lives Matter movement. So the point that I would make in view of what I believe is the similarities, the similar doctrines practiced by both Self-Realization Fellowship and by Ananda, is that race is less important than the fact that we are connected by soul. And so it is our soul connection, which is more important than race. It's more important than gender. It is more important than sexual orientation. It is the belief that we are all members of a human family, one human family. And though this has been a difficult lesson for us to learn, we must still speak up and advocate for that lesson as we move down our spiritual path. That this is what our prophets have implied, and sometimes, it isn't stated as directly as we would like sometimes, but these markers of identity have been so divisive for us. They have meant that people of color um, are constantly engaged uh, in fighting for their rights, uh, but in a state of constant tension that nobody wants. Whether you're on one side of the race markers or not, whether you're on one side of the gender markers or not, I, for one, have to admit that even when I was conscious of race, uh, uh, I was less conscious of sexism until the women in my life began to educate me about those negative processes too. So I allowed ignorance to govern my behavior with respect to women until I was taught how. And I think this is true for all of the isms. People who have chosen uh, different, or who are born with different sexual orientations. They face tremendous uh, opposition. Uh, this is true then also for all of the isms, that we don't have the opportunity to engage them this evening, but they're part of why, as a human family, we don't always act like we're in the same family. And our spiritual path encourages us to act in that fashion. And I'll stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Melvin. That was amazing. Do you want me to show the photo?
Yes, this is Master's photo of the group that he started in Washington, D.C., because he was aware of the importance of race. And it is said to be an all African American group. And there is Master in the middle of it. And curiously, I had made my choice of a spiritual path many years earlier than I was aware of this photo.
Melvin, do you know anything about this group? If it was a group that met, weekly, or was this a special event? Do you know anything about the history?
I have searched, but I haven't been able to find anything about the group yet. I still consider myself searching for more information, and probably I should call SRF and begin my search that way. I've tried to search through everything except the newspapers. I've not tried to research it through the newspapers either. But I think somebody needs to do exactly what you have asked.
We'd like to open it up for questions if anybody has questions for Melvin. Dave, maybe you can see if anyone's in the chat box or anybody's raising a hand.
Can you put us back on the screen so we can see each other? Please? Thanks.
Well, I'm going to ask Giovanna a question because I have not had the chance to do this yet, but I so much respect what she did in the 1960s. And I would like to know whether she shares my appreciation of what she did. So, Giovanna, may I ask
Yes.
you what your perception is of what you did in the 1960s? And then why did you take it upon yourself to engage in such a dangerous enterprise?
You know, my mother asked the same question. It's true, because I was very, very set on going down to the South, very set on being part of the movement. Living in the North, and actually I lived in Brooklyn, New York, and it was a kind of mixed community, not as many Black people as, well, no, that's not true. It's interesting now that I'm mentioning it. There was kind of a line between certain streets and then other streets. And so down other streets, there would be more Black people, and then there would be more white people. And then Puerto Rican people began to come in, and there were Puerto Rican people there. And I felt always in my heart that we were just all one of God's children, that we were all part of each other. And I'm trying to think what exactly took me to actually, the place I went to was Bogalusa. Isn't that a wonderful name for a place?
Super name.
Bogalusa. And I had been feeling for quite a number of years, this is during my college years, that I felt that there was just so much strife and so much division between Black and white, and also feelings. And I'm talking about the white people, because I was in a mixed neighborhood, but still there were more white people than Negro people. And we also had Puerto Rican people at that time, which was new for the area. But I could never really fathom what it was that people were having such a withdrawal from each other. You know, people having their own little section and a withdrawal. Fortunately, in this neighborhood that I lived in, there were the three different kinds of groups, but there weren't many conflicts, or not many serious conflicts. So that was a great blessing. But being in the North and hearing what was happening in the South, that's what propelled me to just go there. It just was within me that I felt like I really had to do something. And for me, it was based spiritually, although most of the people who went down there may or may not have come for spiritual reasons, but I really felt that these are my sisters and brothers. They are God's children, and somehow or another, I want to make a connection, and I want to be helpful. And so I did make it down there, and when I got there, what would happen was people who were coming in to be helpful, we were sorted to sleep and, to be with other people down there, because you don't go down there and rent a hotel, so I was with this one wonderful family, and the mother her name was Alberta, and I just loved Alberta, and Alberta fell too much in love with me, because once we were on, often we were on picket lines, and Alberta was a really tough woman, and she would say to the guys when we were going out to do a demonstration, I don't want anything to happen to her. You don't dare let anything happen to her. It's like she was like my guardian angel, and and trying to make sure that nobody hurt me while I was out there. And actually, nobody did hurt me, except one thing that did happen, which I think was kind of funny. We were in town, and we were having a protest, and we were standing and chanting and all of that. And this white woman comes up to me and throws and takes this little bottle of shoe polish, black shoe polish, and throws it at me. Not the bottle, but the ink all over me. And I thought, boy, she's really trying to make a statement. But guess what? I go home and take a shower, and it's not there anymore. And and also, it felt like, this was the other part of it. Because I was a woman and I was young, the people who were running our program, first of all, Alberta said that there's no way I'm to go to jail, and I wanted to go to jail. Other people were going to jail. Why couldn't I go to jail? Ding dong. But they just wouldn't let me. So this was my jail, just having that thrown back in my face.
It's not too late, Giovanna. You can still go to jail if you want to go.
I could still go. Oh, I thought you were going to say I could still throw black in my face. Hey, you don't know what you're saying. It's true. I could still go to jail. It was just a really treasured experience, because there were many, this Bogalusa was a town where the group had really brought in people, and so we had a large group of people, although we were each living in different houses. And I felt really blessed to be in the house that I was in, and I felt really blessed just to be there in Bogalusa and to experience that, and the loving kindness of the people there was just delicious. It was just delicious, So I don't know if you want to hear more of that, or if you have a question. Do you have any questions about it, Melvin, or anybody else?
I'm anxious to have a complete interview with you, and so, but I think I ought to give everybody a chance and not hog my time with you. But I know what Waluko had a comment to make. So,
Absolutely.
He, I think, is addressing it to the group as a whole.
Okay.
Waluko?
Melvin, I believe that he typed it in the chat. I don't know if he doesn't have a microphone to use. Would you like me to read it out loud?
Yes.
Okay, so Wailuko wrote, I'm curious what you think would be fair reparations for slavery. I see our horrible past and how we as a white country have been privileged by systemic racism from housing and education and even access to healthy food. I've heard some like the idea of just a check, but would that really change much? What can cause real lasting change? I like the idea of free education and housing, but then I am for the idea of free housing, education for everyone. So it still doesn't address the righting of the wrong completely.
Does anybody else want to respond to that? Do you have, does anybody else have any thoughts about reparations? I'll just say that the time will come when the nation addresses more strongly reparations. And I think there have always been people in the United States who wanted to make reparations an issue of priority. It just hasn't happened yet. And I think one idea that I heard in the 1960s from a man by the name of Dr. Robert Brown, who was then, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, he was a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I believe that's in New Jersey. And he believed in something more like a foundation, that would administer funding for needs of people, and it would be directed to, I got the impression it was more group needs that he was thinking about. But Waluko mentioned the term systematic racism, and I think people are beginning to change their focus from the more individual approaches that were high priority during the civil rights movement of the 1960s to this structural or systematic or institutional approach that people seem to prioritize at the moment. And I agree that we don't want this, whatever solution we come up with, we don't want it to be one that has the flavor of a short-term approach. And I think the foundation would have the advantage of maybe investing funding so that a generative approach would be taken, and so that whatever resources were invested, that those resources wouldn't be winnowed away quickly, because the problems of caste and race in the United States have taken so many years to create, and they will likely take many, many years to alleviate those issues, because the effects of systematic racism are said to be in our minds, in our brains, and it's not just a easy problem that can readily be dispensed with. It's going to take generations in order to alleviate the systematic elements. And I return once again to the notion that we've always had a reservoir of people on both sides of the racial issues, as I do believe on gender too. Men have done very harsh and disrespectful behaviors toward women. But you know, as I look at David, I think there's somebody who believes in, you know, that we need to correct what has been done to women in the past too. There's too much quiet violence against women by men, and men need to take responsibility for changing that. And so, you know, in all these areas, we've got to get to the point where the soul connection is more important than these other factors of identity. So, Waluko, I don't think I answered your question, but it is one that I constantly think about.
Hi, everybody. It's Pasqualina. Anastra, did you want to say something? Were you raising your hand? Yeah, why don't you go first and then I'll go.
Okay, this won't take long, but Melvin, it's been such a pleasure hearing you, and it's my first time meeting you, and yeah, I'm sort of at a loss for words as to how you've expanded my consciousness in what you shared this evening. I was born in Maine and raised in New Hampshire, and it's pretty white up here, not only in the winter, but, you know, just overall. But I have done some traveling and have had some experiences. But I was really struck by what you mentioned about the different aspects of slavery, like the Spanish, and then the skillfulness that came with some of the Black people. So I find myself with Wailuko's, his wonderful question, that skillfulness of the Black people, how do we change a level of consciousness for all colors? In other words, I just wonder if part of the reparation would be in the form of education, something that would be really long lasting and into generations. You know, to be able to have a check is you know, it works very well for a very finite time, but to have education and to really explore other areas, like you mentioned that you and your wife had started a Black Studies program, you know, something like that, but also to make it really available for people of color. So anyways, I just want to thank you. This has been a gem of an evening for me. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Anastra. Your name, what is the lineage of your name? The background?
It's a name that was given to me in a special spiritual ceremony. It's like 50 years ago. So, but it has to do with, it's the first time I'm explaining this to my fellow Ananda gurus. It means has to do with past lives, in which some past lives we really did some good works, and of course other lives it's, you know, not so good. But in those lives where good works were accomplished, we carried a certain name that carries the vibration of that life. So Anastra happens to be one of those names. And when my teacher at the time, which was in Glendale, California, anointed me with Anastra, I really had my mind just cracked open. It's like an egg cracking.
Mhm.
And I just started to weep. And it means, she said the definition of Anastra is rising star, heart and mind for God.
Hmm.
And I felt like I had come home in a way. And so this was like I've been on Astra for most of my adult life. So this has been, yeah, and it's an honor to live up to. And then
Mhm.
finding Ananda and all the teachings really has just added more impetus about just really moving forward in the spiritual path.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I look forward to meeting you too in person whenever that is.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
part of our prayer has to always be to help this this deadly virus, this pandemic, come to an end.
And I want to say something to you, Melvin. I want to thank you for what you shared. I bow to you, and I'm just amazed at your spirit to have gone through what you did as a young boy and with your mother and everything you endured. Even though I was born in South America, I'm from, European stock, and it has always enraged me and infuriated me to see how Blacks and Native Americans have been treated. And I don't think we'll ever, ever, ever be able to make reparations for what was done. Never. And now I'm going to be quiet because otherwise I'll start weeping.
Thank you, Inez. It is such a pleasure to be in your presence every time that happens. And now I think Pasqualina is going to comment.
Yes. Hi, everybody. So nice to see you. And thank you, Melvin. This was wonderful. You did a great job. I just wondered if, we were talking earlier and you said something about that Yogananda would have taken up this issue of racism, perhaps, if he hadn't had a different spiritual mission. And I just wondered if you would like to say a couple of words about that, because, it was an interesting comment, and just would love to hear more about that if you don't mind.
So, and somebody else may want to respond to that too, but I remember this photograph of Gandhi and Yogananda meeting with each other. And I think the question came up in the commentary that Yogananda made about the meeting, that what you're doing, Mr. Gandhi, is great work in salvaging the future of humanity, and should I go in that direction too? And I believe it was Divine Mother who said to him that no, the important thing is for you to establish to pursue and complete the mission that you have been entrusted with. And it was a sign that though it might have been attractive for him to ally directly in his work with Gandhi, that it was more important for him to continue the path that he had been that had been designated for him when he came to the United States.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, Melvin. Can you hear
Yes,
me?
Frank, how you doing?
Yes, good to see you.
Good to see you too. I miss all those times that Pasqualina used to arrange for us to get together.
Yes, I miss your hugs and your motivation to me to keep coming and and all that.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much. Very powerful and informative lecture. Thank you. It brings up to me, I grew up in New York City, born 1953, and I think I was blessed in many ways with a mother who was, I think, 17 or 18 when she had me, but she was pretty active with the NAACP and all that in New York. I didn't know that at the time, certainly, but later on. But so I kind of grew up in this household where, it was inclusive, and in Brooklyn at the time, very quickly, the neighborhood was very much integrated. So even in my elementary school system, when I look at my class, I and maybe a couple of other white young boys were in a minority at that point. And this was, in the 50s. Yeah. So, so there's just a couple of interesting things. I mean, even like I have a daughter, 35, Black woman. And we have a difficult relationship, but I've tried to offer her opportunities for healing, not only in her own personal life from birth to the present, but the ancestral trauma that I know she carries.
Mm-hmm.
And what's painful for me is because I'm in many ways powerless to affect change,
Mm-hmm.
short of prayer. And, her mother, who died a number of years ago from some illness, I know she died with so much unresolved. This trauma, not only her personal, but this ancestral trauma, kind of what I was feeling, in your pain tonight as you talked, but from a perspective of a man who's done much healing on himself, So the mother dies in this suffering, and my daughter struggles in her life. And a lot of that's related to being a woman of color in the world and all that means. And, what her mother and grandmother and great-great-grandmother and all the way back to the ships that sailed across the sea. So I just thank you for this lecture tonight,
You should send her the tape of you making this statement.
Yeah.
How old was she again?
She's 35.
35.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have 4 grandchildren, It's freaking crazy.
Do you get a chance to visit them?
Few and far between. Even pre-pandemic, I mean, some were with her, and then there's multiple fathers were involved, and so it's just a complicated situation. And so, yeah.
Send her this tape of you.
And you, to hear you, to hear you as a role model, and that there's liberation can happen, healing can happen. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, as always, for your presence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, man.
So, Kyle, I'm going to turn it back over to you or to David, one of you.
I think unless anyone else has anything to say, we'll probably say good night. It's getting a little bit late, but Melvin, you really are a treasure to all of us. And how many years ago was it when you came to Ananda? Has it been 6 or 7 or 8 years now?
Let me see. Ron would know better. Ron Anta.
Was it from Charles Street, or did you come to Hopkinton first? I was trying to.
I think I came to Hopkinton first.
And then,
Oh, let me take that back. I
No.
do remember at least one occasion where I did come before. So I think I got a taste, and then I said, let me try this a little more. But I do not regret my decision. I'm happy in making that decision.
we are so blessed and happy. And for those who don't know, Melvin is with SRF, and as Ron is, and they've become our spiritual brothers, because we are brothers and sisters. And I think even that little aspect of our relationship with you and Ron is really beautiful, because I think the future of Master's teachings include the two groups healing too and coming together.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it's
Absolutely.
been beautiful to have you in our circle all these years. And thank you so much for tonight. You really are a treasure, and your wisdom and your heart and soul are just so inspiring and so beautiful.
Well, all I know is that you guys are my spiritual family and a very important part of that family.
Well, we love you, Melvin. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
All right.
Melvin.
Thank you
Blessings to
guys.
you.
Thank you guys so much.